registrars are only required to make criminal referrals when a person who is ineligible to vote actually casts a ballot in an election. Further, the current law nor the proposed legislation require an eligible voter or registrant to know that they are ineligible to vote in order to be criminally referred. Without an intent requirement, this provision, Senate Bill 1, could lead to the incarceration of individuals who make simple mistakes. This provision is particularly harmful for individuals who are fully discharged from a final felony conviction. Texas law prevents individuals who are actively serving a sentence for a final felony conviction, which includes incarceration, parole, or probation from being qualified voters. On the other hand, individuals who do not have a final felony conviction, which includes incarceration, parole, or probation from being qualified voters. On the other hand, individuals who do not have a final felony conviction maintain the right to vote as qualified voters. These individuals include people who are convicted of a misdemeanor, have a deferred adjudication judgment, or are waiting trial for a felony conviction. Because many Texans with a criminal history do not understand the nuances of how their convictions or indictments affect their voter eligibility, many of these individuals do not know whether they are eligible or ineligible to vote. Therefore, Senate Bill 1's criminal referral provisions could lead to ineligible voters foregoing the opportunity to vote out of the fear they too will be incarcerated. Currently, Texas law does not require anyone, judges, attorneys, jail staff, or correctional officers to inform individuals the status of their ineligibility from voting. As a result, individuals who are disqualified from voting in Texas may never be told that they cannot vote. Unfortunately, they may only find out that they that they are ineligible to vote after they fill out a voter registration application and have that application rejected or have their actual ballot rejected. Although a proposed provision of the Senate Bill 1 requires courts to inform individuals convicted of a felony offense of their ineligibility to vote, Senate Bill 1 does not require retroactive notice to those Texans who have already been convicted. By criminalizing these Texans' innocent attempts to register to vote, Senate Bill 1 threatens them with the penalty that many of them fear most: reincarceration. I can't imagine if you don't even know that you are not eligible to vote, and say you attempt to vote and you are reincarcerated because you simply did not know. Senate Bill 1 targets naturalized citizens who are registered to vote by kickstarting voter purges based on notoriously inaccurate data provided by the Texas Department of Public Safety. In addition to targeting individuals with prior criminal convictions, Senate Bill 1 also targets naturalized citizens. Senate Bill 1 requires the Secretary of State to compare voter registration, the records with the Texas Department of Public Safety. This is not the first time Texas has attempted to deprive naturalized citizens of their right to vote using DPS's system. 2019, local election administrators challenged the citizenship status of nearly 1,000 registered voters across Texas based on DPS's records at the direction of former Secretary of State David Whitley. I think we all remember that debacle. A few years ago, in fact, CLC's litigation in Texas, Lulac versus Whitley, revealed that Governor Abbott pushed for the challenges. At the time, Secretary of State's office declared that it would continue comparing voter registrations to the DPS database on a monthly basis. However, the former Secretary of State's voter roll purges were so error-prone that a federal judge forced the state to halt the purges altogether. Senate Bill 1 includes an illicit attempt to set the former Secretary of State's failed plans in stone. In Texas, DPS issues driver's license that last 6 years, And many individuals obtain their licenses before they become naturalized citizens and eligible to vote. As a result, DPS's database does not accurately reflect the citizenship status of thousands of Texan voters following CLC's 2019 lawsuit. The state of Texas entered into a settlement agreement with Texas LULAC prohibiting it from using GPS driver's license data to question the citizenship of newly naturalized American citizens. This provision in Senate Bill 1 does not increase election integrity. Or prevent voter fraud. It only serves to prevent naturalized, disproportionately Latino citizens from exercising their right to vote by voiding their lawful voter registration. Senate Bill 1 prohibits counties from hosting drive-through and 24-hour voting. Senate Bill 1 prohibits polling places from being located in tents, any temporary movable structures or facilities primarily designed for motor vehicles. During the 2020 presidential election, we know that Harris County set up 10 drive-through polling places. This method was wildly popular and led over 127,000 voters, approximately 10% of all in-person voters in Harris County, to cast their ballots at drive-through polling places, despite the success of drive-through voting during 2020's high turnout election. Senate Bill 1 would prohibit drive-through voting as an option for Texas voters. Senate Bill 1 also limits early voting, weekday hours, no earlier than 6 a.m. and no later than 9 p.m. Leading up to the 2020 presidential election, Harris County offered 8 24-hour polling locations that allowed voters to cast their ballots outside of traditional voting hours. These expanded hours were critical for voters like Silveria Sanchez, an emergency medical technician dispatcher in Houston, who was able to vote at 12:30 a.m. during a break from her overnight shift at the Texas Medical Center. The expanded hours were similarly useful. They were useful for Houston voter Felix Sylvester, a grain elevator worker on the Houston Ship Channel, whose 8 and 12-hour shifts made it otherwise impossible to cast a ballot during regular voting hours. Senate Bill 1 bans drive-through voting and 24-hour voting, will work in tandem to make it more difficult for blue-collar and essential workers in Texas to cast their ballots. Senate Bill 1 prohibits election officials from sending unsolicited vote-by-mail applications to voters. You know, we had some discussion about this. I believe it was Senator Eckhart and myself who talked about that you'd think you'd want it the other way, the nonpartisan elections administrator sending the ballots and not a particular or partisan campaign, a particular candidate doing that. Texas unnecessarily stringent eligibility requirements for who can vote by mail ensure that a large portion of its male voters are over the age of 65 or living with disabilities. Prohibiting election officials from sending mail ballot application to these groups of voters does not serve to improve the integrity of Texas's elections. It merely serves to prevent the voters who need it most from being able to easily access mail ballot applications and vote safely, securely, conveniently by mail. Senate Bill 1 threatens any election official who solicits a voter to vote by mail, either directly or indirectly, with conviction of a state jail felony. These are just a handful of the problematic provisions in Senate Bill 1 that make it harder for Texans to vote and harder for county clerks to administer elections. This committee should not support. Good morning, Senator West.
Good morning.
This committee should not support a bill that needlessly disenfranchises voters across the Lone Star State. CLC strongly urges the committee to vote no on Senate Bill 1. This is, again, the Campaign Legal Center. Now, go to testimony from every Texan. Every Texan appreciates the opportunity to submit testimony related to Senate Bill 1, election integrity, security. Maybe it should be insecurity. Every Texas opposes Senate Bill 1 for the following reasons. As the 87th legislative session begins its first special session on July 8th to address voting legislation that failed in the regular session, it's important for the public and the legislative members to consider the context of this proposal. Electoral reform proposals do not happen in a vacuum. There is history in Texas of using false allegations of voter fraud or election integrity as a proxy for voter suppression. So much that for years, Texans had to get prior approval from the U.S. Department of Justice for any electoral change according to Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. As the demographic makeup of the state has evolved, voter discrimination efforts have intensified. Texas is home to the second largest Latino population. Senator West, I was talking about you earlier. I was talking about the exchange that you and I had about the Voting Rights Act and our great president right here. And people like you and I, Senator Blanco, are making sure we do everything to continue the legacy. And of course, with your Barbara Jordan Fairness Act, we are continuing their legacy. And these were Texas giants. Maybe one day in the history books, they will look and see what we were doing when it came to defending our democracy. Yes, I think we're going to put your picture over there. Yeah, maybe. Okay. So, anyway, I just wanted to share that with you, that I was regressing a little bit and talking about you, but it was all good. Again, this is every Texan. I'm going to read just parts of their testimony. As the demographic makeup of the state has evolved, voter discrimination efforts have intensified. Texas is home to the second largest Latino population in the United States. And demographic projections show that by 2040, Latinos will constitute the majority of citizens in the state. Texas also has a black population of more than 2 million and a consistently growing Asian American population. This makes Texas an ethnic minority majority state in total population, but not in voting strength. The increasing number of racial and ethnic groups in Texas highlights the need to vigilantly protect the voice and electoral rights of the state's Latino, Black, and Asian American electorate. Changes such as removing polling locations, adding new identity documentation, or the procedures for mail-in ballots would have been approved to ensure Latinos, Blacks, and Asian voting power was not retrogressed. But it was considered to be the heart of the Voting Rights Act. Senator West, we were just talking about that again. Because it stopped voter discrimination before it happened and placed the burden on the state to prove that electoral changes on the state or local level would not put Latino, Black, or Asian voters in a worse position in terms of electoral power.
Yes, Senator Whitmire, what purpose?
Will the senator yield?
You yield?
I absolutely yield to Dean Whitmire.
Thank you, Mr. President, for the opportunity to ask a couple of questions that I think we really need to clarify, Senator Alvarado. First of all, I appreciate the opportunity to to ask you questions and give you an opportunity to respond. I think we need to clear up the Harris County process that this bill will prevent going forward. As you and I have discussed previously, I think you and I first got involved in a campaign in '92. I think you were a U of H student. I was running for re-election to the Senate.
That's correct.
And quite frankly, we bonded politically and personally. And I'm only going back in history to discuss what the process was then, how it's evolved. And would you agree with me that when you were a U of H student running for precinct judge in your community in 1992, I was running for re-election after 10 years in the Senate, previously 10 in the House, that we probably thought that the process was working, transparent, fair. Certainly, we didn't have any objections, nor the people we were representing. Would you agree the '92 election process, and I was and you,
Yeah.
both were in very heated, competitive election judge primary and a Senate primary?
Absolutely. I remember it like it was yesterday.
Boy, me too. So we thought things were good. We had very competitive races against very aggressive opponents that would have probably tried anything to beat you as a precinct judge candidate and me for re-election.
Yes, we had some common interest.
Yeah, we certainly did. We were against the same machine.
Yeah.
And it's worth noting that the first line of defense against any fraudulent, improper election practices were going to be you and me as candidates, because we were certainly watching other candidates' efforts to defeat you and I in 1992.
Correct.
So they weren't successful, and we had, as best we can determine, very honorable, clean, trustworthy campaigns. Now let's travel. How long ago has that been? I've been in the Senate 48 after it. That's 28 years ago. 28 years ago. In the meantime, I've remained in the Senate. You have served in council through those citywide. You run citywide or a district? I believe district, I guess.
It was district.
So you represented your community, competitive races. I have had other campaigns for the Senate. And there again, each and every campaign, we have been very observant of the process, found it to work well. People had access to the polls without interference, without any attempt to interfere. So going back in time, that process continued to work. Did you, as a council member, ever, and I as a senator can say, I've never had anyone complain about how elections were conducted, except sometime maybe have to wait in line to vote. But have you had any real questions brought to you while you were an elected council member about any election process that could be tainted or fraudulent or crooked? I mean, I'm asking you to go back in this early morning, back in time. fact, I guess it would be easier to ask you, when's the first time someone started complaining to you or you would hear objections to elections maybe being fraudulent? Did you ever hear it while you were in city government?
No, I never heard of anything that was fraudulent.
Yeah. Now, we obviously had, back in those days, polling hours set out. In fact, if you recall, one of the complaints I received in recent years was early voting that first week would shut down at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. You familiar with that complaint?
Yes. Yes.
Why in the world would the county administration, county clerk, commissioner's court allow, if you won't, open elections, encouraging people to vote? Why would they close at 4 o'clock in the afternoon in a city like Houston that has so many?
I'm not advised.
Well, I'm advised that, in my judgment, it was one of the first appearances of voter suppression. If you're going to have early voting, and it's going to stop when most folks, hourly wage earners, get off at 5, or you might even include school teachers that have to stay at school later than 4. Why in the world would you stop at 4?
Well, I think your answer was
Sure. I think it's to discourage people, make it more difficult. But back to our election history, your own council, no complaints. You had the opportunity to then be a state representative. Did you ever hear any complaints about the voting process while you were a state representative? How long were you in the House?
10 years, just like you.
10 years? Wow, time flies. You were in the House 10 years. Recall a citizen complaint?
Never.
Local official complaint?
No, people were calling about dead dogs and getting their trash picked up.
No, that's when
Stuff you're about to find out about.
That's when you were a council member.
Oh, yeah. No, state rep, no.
Well, you know what? Guess what? Do you know how many calls I get as a state senator about trash pickup and about loose dogs and about city issues? Do you still get those calls?
All the time.
And you know why? In my judgment, we're accessible. I get probably during the interim as many calls about city, county, and a fair amount of federal calls because I'm in the community, got a district office you can walk into, and I'm certain you experience the same thing. And you know what? We address them, we pick up the phone and call. But back to this election process, which brings us together today. You're 10 years in the House. Did you ever get a citizen or local official call or request to fix a broken election process?
No, sir, I did not.
Well, you know what? I haven't, during your 10 years in the House, I was here serving. I never did either. So let's keep going forward to how we come together in this proposition. You've been in the Senate how long?
Not quite 3 years.
Okay, your first term?
I'm in my second term.
Second term. So during your tenure in the Senate, have you had a citizen or local official call and complain to you about the election process, that it was broken, fraudulent, and needed fixing?
No. I've never gotten any of those.
Not even one?
No.
You know what? Received none. Now, we did have the voter ID issue, which was hotly contested. We had an all-night, in fact, the last time I recall the Senate, well, that's not true. about a month ago, 2 months ago during the regular, we were here all night. But I can recall being here all night on voter ID. And that was a hotly contested matter that has been implemented. Other than that matter, can you recall a controversy involving the elections?
No, sir, I don't.
Okay. So when, in your judgment, did it become a relevant issue to take up in the eyes of the proponents? When do you, now Senator Hughes does a fine job of defending his, bringing us forward in that previous session for that, he correctly states that he's brought election bills before us. But when's the first time you heard the allegation that campaigns or elections could be fraudulent?
Well, I'd say it was sometime after the 2020 election.
Yeah, would you not believe it's your recollection, and could we agree that it was probably the November 2020 even presidential election?
That's accurate.
So that presidential election by then President Trump said it was going to be a fraudulent election. He actually has stated publicly he believes it was stolen. So we came into session in January. Was it your expectation that we would have a complete redo or a proposed election bill, which brings us to this morning in July? Were you expecting the session to be dominated? Of course, we had other major issues like COVID, which, to I think most of our surprises, we conducted a successful session under those COVID conditions. And then we had the freeze, which certainly challenged the session. But when you got here in January, would you have put the election proposal in the top 3 categories of what we dealt with?
No, I, like you, thought we would be focused on the pandemic, the grid, the economy. Why don't we talk about the bill?
Okay. Well, I'm getting to the bill. How did you see the bill evolve? Do you think it was largely as a result of maybe the Harris County experience, which got the attention and the concern of the proponents? Is it your judgment that certainly coming out of the Harris County new measures, which the proponents will emphasize are not permitted in the election code, do you think that probably triggered as much debate as anything?
I would agree with your assessment on that, Dean.
Think that, as I mentioned earlier this morning, that we might have an opportunity to have a roundtable discussion with the proponents of this bill, who are also the opponents of drive-through voting, 24-hour voting, and drop boxes. Do you think it would be positive after this bill, ultimately, because of the makeup of the body, will pass, that we request an opportunity to meet with the colleagues across the aisle to work on maybe further election law review that would maybe hopefully have a better understanding of why Harris County went with those measures, and that in fact they actually worked, and maybe other communities might want to consider a version of the Harris County measure? Think that would be positive?
I think it would be positive moving forward, and this has been a very contentious issue, a very partisan issue, and I know this body takes great pride in trying to work across the aisle, I think it would help to maybe hit the reset button as far as this body goes and try to find some common ground.
Well, thank you. Let me thank you for your public service, your courageous strength and passion that you've showed all night. I will yield the floor to you, but I hope your mission, as you represent your district and the state, will include the opportunity to say there are honest disagreements in the legislature, and that we all represent the state of Texas in our individual districts, and we need to sit down and try to agree without being disagree without being disagreeable, and that we might can find some common measures that would assist people in having even greater access to the polls.
I thank you, Dean, for your comments and your question. You talked about that earlier in the evening, and I think it's a very reasonable suggestion going forward. One real point of contention that you and I have had with this bill is the provisions on the poll watchers. And as you know, when we started this discussion at 6 o'clock yesterday evening, we asked people to send their stories, and I can't tell you how many I got, people commenting on poll watchers as we were talking about it through the evening. So I think tonight served a purpose that I set out, which was to shine the light, put the brakes on, and some of us, I mean, we went through the bill page by page, pretty much line by line and almost word for word. And it was a nice refresher of what was in the bill. So I think that your request is definitely in order, and I look forward to being a part of that. I want to just get close to finishing this testimony here. I believe this one was... this was the Every Texan. Okay. Since 1982, there have been at least 30 successful Section 5 enforcement actions in which the Department of Justice has participated prior to the Shelby County versus Holder. I think we all know about that. It's been a case that has prompted many pieces of legislation and action since then. A U.S. Supreme Court decision that struck down the coverage from formula for Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. When the Supreme Court struck down the formula that Congress enacted on which states and jurisdictions Section 5 could be applied to, it effectively gutted the enforcement of the act. Without Section 5 protection, Texas officials are free to discriminate and enact voting changes that will reduce the voting power of ethnic and racial minorities until these communities bring a lawsuit and prove the discrimination often after the impact. Good morning, Senator Eckhart. Good seeing you not so long ago. And, you know, this goes right into kind of what we've been talking about throughout the night. Texas continuously being in the courts when it comes to voting rights and, of course, redistricting and issues like that. With or without Section 5, local county election officials are on the front lines to make sure voting is secure and accessible to all. Traditionally, county election officials are given a fair amount of leeway to implement and conduct elections with guidance from the Secretary of State. And even with Section 5, Texas consistently ranks at the bottom in turnout, usually around the 11th from the bottom of all states. During the pandemic, counties like Harris, Bexar, and Travis attempted to make voting safer by instituting more mobile voting sites, drive-through voting procedures, expanded hours for polling locations, and mail-in ballot access for eligible voters. These procedures did not alter any state law requirements. In fact, Secretary of State Ruth Hughes confirmed that Texas had a smooth and secure election in 2020. Those were her words. So, passing legislation in this manner diminishes the faith of the electorate in the voting process and contributes to the false narrative that elections are rigged. In the end, the institution of democracy itself is diminished. This can have lasting impacts. Youth who reported having been either encouraged to vote or taught how to register to vote in high school are more likely to vote and participate in other civic activities. For so many of these reasons, every Texan respectfully asked members of the committee to vote Senate Bill 1. That was their testimony. I'm going to move away from the witness testimony in committee. And start on something else. Before I go into this, Mr. President, I want to thank you, your office, the clerks, for having a line of communication with me as I launched into this filibuster. I appreciate all the ladies who have been here, the staff working, your office. Everybody has conducted themselves in a very professional manner, and I think that speaks a lot to this body. Who we are, Democrats, as Republicans, as senators, but most of all, as Texans. My friends, voter suppression anywhere is a threat to democracy everywhere. As we draw this discussion to an end, it is my sincere hope that simple acts by everyday Texans, from the Senate floor to the ballot box, can help to shed the light on all important issues. What do we want our democracy to look like? Do we want our state to be more or less inclusive? We want to make it harder or easier to vote for seniors who cherish their right to make their voice heard. Do we want access to our electoral process to be more difficult for people with disabilities? Or do we want to remove barriers for them? For our communities of color, do we want to defend the tremendous progress that we've made in civil rights and equality, or chip away at their voting rights on Senate Bill 1 at a time? Let's be clear, instead of making it easier to vote, this bill makes it easier to intimidate. Instead of making it harder to cheat, it makes it harder to vote. After all the rhetoric and practice politicians, consultants, and partisans and operators, this truly comes down to the people that entrusted us with their vote. They sent us to Austin to empower their voices, not to silence them. I proudly stand here with my colleagues who have been so supportive and outspoken and leaders in this issue, defending our democracy. I stand for my constituents who are not only targeted by the GOP under this bill, but will be disproportionately harmed. I think about the multi-generational families in the East End whose abuela has never missed an election but still needs just a little help filling out her ballot by mail. I stand and speak for the single mother from the near north side of Houston who, out of concern for COVID exposure and the inability of her little children to stand in long lines, took advantage of drive-through option. Does her vote not count? Does that sound like fraud to you? I stand and speak for the persons with disabilities from Pasadena who rely on assistance from loved ones and others for access to their polling locations and ballot boxes. I rise to speak for the shift worker from Galena Park who day in and day out works long and hard hours on the docks of the Houston Ship Channel, our economic engine, and who took advantage for the 24-hour voting option in Harris County. I rise to speak for the poll worker from Aldine who loves the electoral process so much they signed up to be a poll worker and sacrifice their time, energy, and talents to help administer our elections in a fair, safe, and secure way. Under this bill, this poll worker will now have to contend with untrained partisan poll watchers, possibly bullying and profiling voters and exposing them to retaliatory partisan lawsuits and excessive criminal penalties for honest clerical mistakes. I am a proud member of this body, and as every other member of this distinguished body understands, my duty is first to my constituents, so I do thank the members of this body for patiently listening and allowing me to present my constituents today and speak on their behalf. I am confident that any other member of this body does and would do the same for their people. To my local colleagues and friends in Houston and Harris County, I felt like I needed to speak up for you. As the third largest county in America, I am so incredibly proud of the way my county conducted our elections during the general election in a way that was safe as possible, as secure as possible, as accessible as possible. Harris County proved to the rest of the country that you don't have to sacrifice election integrity in order to increase access to our electoral process. You can make it easier to vote in a safe and secure way despite the overwhelming success that many of my colleagues to office my county was targeted with partisan attacks. Dean Whitmire, you know that. I know you're taking it personal. Our buddy, God bless him, Boris Miles, has been watching. We know he is with us here in spirit. In fact, many of the provisions of this bill are shamelessly aimed at stopping Harris County from making our elections safe and effective. What's wrong with drive-through voting during a pandemic? What's wrong with the 24-hour voting? Why can't we have expanded voting hours for the people who have to work late? Where is all the so-called fraud? The people are still waiting for someone to actually demonstrate real evidence of fraud in these measures. Where does it end? Today it's SB 1, tomorrow it'll be some other manufactured crisis to justify the systematic chipping away of our voting rights. And little by little, every session, we just keep chipping away until one day we wake up and realize our democracy is unrecognizable. I gaze at the portrait, Senator West, you and I have been talking about quite a bit, a true Texas giant our president, Lyndon Baines Johnson, I'm reminded of his words on the day in 1965 when he signed the Voting Rights Act and when he said, "The vote is the most powerful instrument ever devised by man for breaking down injustice and destroying the terrible walls which imprison men because they are different from other men." It is on his legacy that Texas Democrats in both chambers draw the line in the sand and say unapologetically and in one accord for the world to hear that voter suppression anywhere is a threat to democracy everywhere. Thank you. Gratefully, thank you, Mr. President and members. Thank you.